Hey, cool kids. Welcome back to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm Greg Payne, and I am glad you've chosen to spend a little time with me today. When you're hearing this, this is going to be the July 3rd release date, but I'm really going to be talking about July 4th and the United States 250th birthday. We are getting ready to celebrate Independence Day, and there's going to be flags and fireworks, cookouts, parades, and plenty of opportunities to gather with children and grandchildren. When I was thinking back about this anniversary, it brought me back memories of when I was 6 years old when America turned 200. It was 1976, and I was living in Louisville, Kentucky. I don't remember every detail, but I remember the feeling that was there. There were flags flying everywhere. There were parades, family gatherings, neighborhood celebrations. People seemed to be genuinely excited to be part of something bigger than themselves. As a 6 year old, I didn't really fully understand the significance of the bicentennial other than people were really, really hyped about it. I imagine it would be similar to when little kids were around for the conclusion of, let's say, World War II and VE Day and the VJ Day, right? Is if you're a little kid, you just don't quite get the significance of that day. So, as a 6 year old, of course, I couldn't have explained to anybody what the Declaration of Independence was or the Revolutionary War, but I knew something important was happening. Our family, we had our own parade around the block with the neighborhood kids and everything else. It was just crazy, and then life happened, like with everybody, right? I grew up. I moved away from 1979 until about 1992. I lived in the Washington, D.C. area. I experienced July 4th celebrations in Northern Virginia and our nation's capital. If you've ever been to Washington during Independence Day, you know it's something special. The monuments, the crowds, the music, the fireworks over the National Mall, it reminds you that history isn't just something in the books, it's something that we really do inherit. I mean, you're seeing the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, all that stuff right down there at the mall during that 4th of July time. And, 50 years after America's bicentennial, we are getting ready to celebrate 250 years. The 6-year-old boy who watched the bicentennial is now a grandfather himself. I've got the gray hair, I've got some aches and pains and all that stuff. But this has also got me thinking about legacy in a very different way, not just America's legacy, but family legacy, the kind of legacy that grandfathers leave behind. When I think of some of the founding fathers, I now start to wonder about other aspects of their lives. It was easy for me growing up to understand Washington, how he grew up, the things that he went through, inheriting Mount Vernon, trying to become a British officer, being rejected for that, his time in the French and Indian War, and then his times after that. I know those things, but I think it's been because I'm getting older that I start to think about some of his other relationships, as well as the relationships in the family aspect of some of those family founding fathers. We, oftentimes, like I said, we know them as their statesmen, we know them as revolutionaries, but today I really want to dive in and explore a side of America's founders that doesn't really make it into the history books very often, and certainly doesn't get covered in elementary schools or primary schools. We are going to talk about a few of America's first grandfathers. And more importantly, what I want us to do is ask, what can modern grandfathers learn from them? When most people think about legacy, they think big. They think in terms of what kind of buildings might have my name on it or that I create, what kind of businesses that I've built, and what kind of books maybe I've written. They think of political achievements. When you think about the presidents, there's under 50 of them. I should know this, but there's like 44 presidents. I think maybe 46 even. I'd have to go back and look. And sorry that I don't keep track of all of that stuff. But what I mean by that is that each one of those people, no matter what you think of them, had an influence on American history, world history, and left a legacy, good and bad, for their time in influencing the direction of our country and policies. And so I think one of the things that as other grandfathers, we start thinking in terms of two, the kind of legacy that we're going to live. If we're not, creating a big skyscraper in New York, if we're not creating a multi-billion-dollar business, we start to think about the legacies that we leave. And I think that our legacies, when we think about them, have more to do with the lasting impact on our children and grandchildren, our family and friends. And so this is where I think our definition of legacy begins to change. We start realizing that it's not just what we leave behind in terms of physical, let's say physical artifacts, right? But it's who we leave behind. And the founding fathers certainly left us a nation, and many of them were also in the midst of trying to build their families, their fortunes. They would be people that we would consider now like 30s, 40s, most of them. And so they had young families, a lot of them. They had businesses, law practices that were growing. And I think history suggests that some were far more successful than others when it comes to their relationships and their families. As grandfathers, I think we have an opportunity that many younger men don't yet appreciate. We get to influence generations we may never fully see. The seeds we plant today may bloom decades after we're gone, right? That time you spend with that young 4-year-old granddaughter, that could be a big influencing part of that relationship and her self confidence and everything that she carries forward because of the time you spent intentionally building her up. And I think the founding fathers understood this better than we often realize. And so I want to dive into about four of these men and touch a little bit about what they had going and the differences in their relationships with grandchildren, with family. And so what I want to do is I want to start with Thomas Jefferson. And when most people think of Jefferson, they think of the Declaration of Independence. Certainly, they think of him as the Secretary of State, the Louisiana Purchase, the President of the United States. They think of Monticello. They in UVA. Let's not forget UVA. They think of a brilliant thinker and a writer, but Jefferson also became a grandfather many times over. In fact, he ended up having, I think, about 12 grandchildren. And as Jefferson aged, his correspondence reveals something fascinating. When we dive into those letters, when we dive into the correspondence back and forth, we can see that he increasingly focused in on his family. He invited his grandchildren to stay with him. He took an active interest in their education. He encouraged reading, learning, curiosity, as well as personal growth. All the things that he really valued, he wanted to encourage into the grandchildren. And now, certainly, Jefferson wasn't perfect. Like all historical figures, he had his contradictions and his flaws, and he had just complications. I mean, we all are complicated, right? But here's the thing, when it came to his grandchildren, we really do, I think, see a man who understood the value of mentorship. He was mentored, and then he in turn mentored others. He wrote letters, he shared advice, he invested time. And think about that for a moment. One of the most accomplished men in American history was spending time helping his grandchildren learn. Even though he was president, former president, he was trying to make his plantation work. He was trying to establish universities. He was trying to push forward political ideas and ideals and lead a party that was oftentimes in contention with the political parties of the Northeast. He wasn't just simply trying to be remembered for what he had done. He was trying to prepare his grandchildren. And that's an important distinction. Many grandfathers, I think, worry about whether they will be remembered. But to me, it seems more that Jefferson was concerned about whether his grandchildren would be ready for life, ready for responsibility, ready to contribute. And as a grandfather, I think maybe our goal isn't just to become unforgettable, but perhaps our goal is or should be to become useful, to become a source of wisdom, to be a sounding board, a teacher, a storyteller, a safe harbor, especially. And the older I get, the more convinced I am that grandchildren don't necessarily need us to be perfect grandparents with the perfect meals, the perfect vacations, the perfect times spent together. They need us to be present grandparents. Jefferson's example to me reminds me that time and attention may be among the greatest gifts that we can ever give to our grandchildren. And now I want to pivot over to George Washington. And, the interesting thing with George Washington is that Washington, presents a fascinating case because he never had biological children of his own. And yet he became something many people today can relate to, a grandfather through relationship rather than biology. When Washington married Martha Custis, he stepped into an existing family. Boy, that sounds familiar to me. Over time, he became deeply involved with her children and her grandchildren, and he advised them. He helped educate them. He cared about their futures. He offered guidance. And in many ways, he became a grandfather figure by choice. And I love this story because it speaks directly to, I think, modern families. And it's really interesting to me to be thinking that, Washington, of all people, could be so relatable to the way that families are made up today. I mean, we've got so many families that come in so many different forms, such as blended families and adopted families, step families, families connected by friendship, mentorship, and love. There are countless men today who may not share DNA with their grandchildren, but they still show up. They still commit to being that mentor, to being that great grandparent. They attend the games, they read bedtime stories, they help with homework, they teach life lessons. George Washington, I think, reminds us that grandfatherhood is not merely a biological title, it's a relational role. It's not about what a DNA test says, it's about who shows up, who listens, who encourages, who guides. The truth is that some of the most influential grandfathers in a child's life may not be biological grandfathers at all. And I've talked about this before, they may be the step grandfathers. They are probably mentors, family friends, church leaders, teachers, coaches, men who choose to invest in the next generation. Washington's life teaches us that legacy often begins with a simple decision. I will be present. I will show up. I will be there when they need me. And now I want to move on to John Adams, number 2 president. And as we move over to Adams, I think, is one of my favorite founding fathers because he seemed to understand something that many people overlook. And that is that character compounds. Just like money can compound over time, so can values. Adams and his wife Abigail invested heavily in their children. They emphasized education, responsibility, integrity, public service, and that result, their son, John Quincy Adams, became the 6th president of the United States. Now, becoming president isn't the point. I mean, not every grandkid's going to become president. But the point is that influence, that setting up the values of what is important for the family, the values that get transmitted from one generation to the next influences how the preceding generations will grow and develop, what they will honor, what they will go after. As grandparents, we're often tempted to underestimate our impact. I know I certainly am. And, maybe it's because our grandchildren are young. In my case, they're all under 8 years old at this time. They're going to be under 9 pretty soon. Maybe because the grandchildren don't always appear to be listening. And maybe sometimes technology seems to have their attention more than we do. But influence is rarely immediate. A lesson shared at age 8 may not make sense until age 28. A story told during a fishing trip may be remembered decades later. And one of the things that I can really attest to with this is when I've interviewed adult grandchildren, whether it's granddaughters or grandsons, and they always talk about being that 10 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old, whatever it is, and the lessons that their grandfathers taught them, whether it was tossing the keys to a farm truck to a 10-year-old to drive back to the house and go grab lunch and cold water and bring it out to the people working in the field, or it could be including young kids in going and buying a truck or going to a cattle auction or doing something. But those memories really stay with people. And I talk to these people when they're in their 50s and 60s and older. And so, yeah, the lessons that we think might not soak in, they are definitely there and they're definitely remembered decades later. A value demonstrated consistently, I think, can quietly become part of the grandchild's identity. The Adams, I think, remind us that we're not simply living our lives, we're modeling our lives. We model how we respect others, we model how we value education. And our grandchildren are sometimes watching us much more than they are listening to us. And it's almost like we have to have a reminder, right, about where kids, they see everything and they hear everything, even though it may look like it's going over their heads. It's really not. I do want to move over and talk to another one. Benjamin Franklin, I thought was great. And I don't think we could have a discussion about any of America's founders and have it be complete without including Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was many things, as a lot of you know. He was an inventor, a writer, a diplomat, a scientist, an entrepreneur, and he had a lot of other qualities too. Some of those that we want to emulate, and some of those that are best left for late night conversations around a campfire, let's say. But perhaps his greatest gift was his ability to tell stories and share wisdom. I think that's really where some of Franklin's statecraft made a big impression, was his ability to take an idea and take a request, but then frame it and build it into a story. And Franklin understood that the ideas really do become much more memorable when attached to a story. And one reason his sayings have survived for the centuries is been because of that they're always tied in, right? And it's simple things, whether it's I think it was the poor something almanac. I can't remember it tonight. But some of those things, early to bed, early to rise, right? And some of these other things that get tied into some of the stories. And what I want to do is have you think a little bit, what stories do your grandchildren really know about you? What stories do they know about their family, about their parents, about your parents? And obviously these are going to be age and situational dependent and appropriate, but those stories really, I think, provide a sense of family memory. When we become the keeper of the stories, we become also the guardians of that family history. We're bridging between generations. And if we don't tell those stories, they often disappear. And these stories, in my opinion, are often best served around a dinner table when people are eating and you're suddenly remembering about what school was like when you grew up, what life was like if you're old enough to remember or have grandparents, about what it was like to have food rationing in the country and victory gardens and all sorts of things. And I'm drifting back to those situations around World War II. But the stories of our grandparents, if we don't share those around the table and we don't share those around the campfire, those disappear. And when a grandparent dies, I think an entire library of family history can really disappear with them. And that's why I encourage grandfathers to tell stories. Record your stories, your diaries, even if they're short, they don't even have to be super long, and it doesn't have to be, Tuesday, July 15th, I did this or I did that. July 16th, here's what I did. It's great if you have that, but sometimes just sitting down and writing or recording the stories is great. But be sure that you share those stories. And it's not necessarily because your life was extraordinary, but it's because your life was yours. And one day your grandchildren may treasure those stories more than you can imagine. Maybe the story of you overcoming, not being able to read. Maybe you have dyslexia or something. I don't know. But you sharing your thoughts about overcoming something like that and then being able to progress and still have a great future and still accomplish a lot. Maybe that's the story somebody that's not even born yet needs to hear to help them get over a hurdle themselves. And so make sure that you share those stories just like Benjamin Franklin, find those themes, find those things and make sure they're shared. And then, let's be honest, the founding fathers weren't perfect and they were far from it. Some struggled with family relationships. I think of Franklin, he and his son became estranged because Franklin went with the rebellion in the colonists. And his son, I think, was royal governor of Pennsylvania and ended up evacuating. And they had a huge falling out. And I don't know if they ever really made up or not. And that's just one aspect, right? Some of these guys were better philosophers and thinkers and statesmen than they were husbands and fathers and sons. And some of them spent long periods of time away from the loved ones. And oftentimes they made mistakes and they carried burdens and contradictions. And in that sense, they were remarkably human. They were very much like you and I. I mean, we've got stuff that maybe we're not super proud of, and we've got stuff that contradicts maybe what we really value, but we still have behaviors that can contradict what our values are. And, I think that might be an encouraging lesson is that we don't have to be perfect grandparents to leave a meaningful legacy. We don't have to have all the answers. And you don't have to have unlimited time, unlimited money, or unlimited wisdom. You just have to be intentional and just show up and be willing to be there. And I think if we look back, we see that Jefferson teaches us to be that mentor, and Washington teaches us that we can choose relationships and we can impact those that we choose to have relationships with. Adams teaches us to pass on family values or values that our family has. And Franklin teaches us to share stories. Those are the things that every grandfather can do. And here's where I want to start to wrap this up. As America celebrates 250 years, I'd like to offer you a challenge. 250 years ago, the founding fathers were thinking about a future that they would never see. Some of them doubted it would last more than probably 50 years. Most of them could never have imagined the world that we live in today. And yet, I think their actions shaped generations. We still go back and search for them. We still go back and we have new books that are brought forward. We still have new movies about them. We're still trying to understand them as the founding fathers, of course, but I think also the grandfathers. How do we reconcile their lives to the ideals that we have as a family of these United States? And that's where I think grandfathers, we become very similar to those founding fathers, is that we can leave all of these things and we can live intentionally as grandparents every single day. We invest in futures that we will never fully witness. I may never witness my grandkids getting married or having kids of their own or whatever. But if we can be intentional with those relationships, the seeds whose harvest may come long after we're gone are going to be great seeds and develop into great futures for our families. So here's a question for you. When your grandchildren think about you years from now, what is it that they will remember? Will they remember your stories, your encouragement, your kindness, your faith, your humor, the time you spent together, the values that you lived? Legacy isn't built in a single moment. It's built in ordinary moments, repeated consistently over time. A conversation, a phone call, a ball game, a whitewater kayaking adventure, a shared meal, a bedtime story. Those moments become memories, and memories become the legacy. As a 6-year-old boy living in Louisville, Kentucky, I celebrated America's 200th birthday. I had no idea what the next 50 years would hold. I couldn't have imagined where my life would take me. I couldn't have imagined the people I would meet, the lessons I would learn, or the grandchildren I would someday love. And that's the thing about both nations and families. Neither one is built in a day. They are built generation by generation. They are built through trial and error, and they are built by reconciliation of sometimes falling short of ideals. But I think that they continue to be built conversation by conversation and relationship by relationship. The founding fathers gave us a nation that has endured for 250 years. Our challenge as grandfathers is simpler, but no less important, to leave our grandchildren with stories worth remembering, values worth carrying forward, and memories worth sharing. Because one day our grandchildren will tell stories about us. The question is, what stories are we helping them create today? Hey, enough of this. I hope you guys have barbecues and everything lined up for this. And I want to thank you for joining me. If you're happening to watch this on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm trying to grow some of the viewership and things over there so we can help grow the show. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with another grandfather, a father, or a family member who might appreciate it. Until next time, keep building memories, keep sharing wisdom, and keep strengthening the bonds that connect generations. I hope you have a fun 4th of July if you are in these United States. And if you are not celebrating the 4th of July, I hope you have a fun weekend with family and friends. Until we talk again, friends, I want you to remember to be cool.